Maria woke before dawn, as she did every day, to the sound of birds stirring in the sprawling gardens of the Aldridge estate. The old manor house loomed in the pale morning light, its stone walls wrapped in ivy that had grown thick over the decades. Inside, the air was always cool and still, as though the weight of its history kept it from ever truly feeling alive. Maria tied her apron snugly and began her morning routine. The kitchen was her first stop, where she lit the stove and prepared tea for Mr. Aldridge, the owner of the estate. He was a man of quiet habits and stricter routines, rarely deviating from his predictable schedule. Though they lived under the same roof, Maria and Mr. Aldridge hardly spoke. Their interactions were brief and formal. Maria offering a polite "Good morning, sir," and Mr. Aldridge responding with a curt nod or nothing at all. As she carried the tray of tea to his study, Maria paused for a moment outside the heavy oak door. Through the crack, she caught a glimpse of him sitting at his desk, his back rigid, his gaze fixed on a framed photograph that stood in the corner of his workspace. It was of a woman, beautiful and poised, whose presence seemed to haunt the room even in her absence. Maria knew it was his late wife, though no one dared speak of her. The sorrow in Mr. Aldridge's eyes whenever he looked at that photograph spoke volumes. Maria moved on, leaving the tea where she always did, and continued with her duties. The house was vast, with more rooms than anyone used. She had grown familiar with its creaking floors and dimly lit corridors, but there were places she rarely ventured: an attic cluttered with forgotten relics, and a library filled with books too delicate to touch. The grandeur of the estate had always felt separate from her own life. She was a maid, nothing more, and the estate's history, its secrets, belonged to another world. Still, there was something about the house that stirred Maria's curiosity. The portraits lining the grand staircase, with their solemn faces and ornate frames, felt like silent sentinels guarding stories she would never be privy to. Sometimes she imagined what it might have been like to live as one of them, to wear the fine gowns, attend the lavish parties, and have a life that wasn't confined to the servants' quarters. But those were fleeting thoughts, easily dismissed as she scrubbed floors and polished silverware. Despite her lowly position, Maria had a quiet dignity about her. She worked tirelessly, but never complained. Her hands were calloused from years of labor, yet there was a gentleness in her touch that seemed to imbue even the smallest tasks with care. The other servants often remarked on her kindness, how she would offer to take on extra work or help them when they fell behind. What no one knew, not even Maria herself, was that her connection to the estate ran deeper than she could have imagined. She didn't know why she sometimes felt an odd sense of belonging here, why the sight of certain objects, a vase in the dining room, a tapestry in the parlor, stirred vague, unformed memories in her mind. She had no family, no past that she could remember clearly, only fragments of stories her late mother had told her when she was a child. Her mother had worked as a maid too, though she'd rarely spoken of it. As the sun rose higher, Maria paused for a moment in the garden, taking in the scent of blooming roses. This was her favorite part of the day, when the world felt quiet and still, and she could steal a few moments of peace before the chaos of chores took over. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the sun wash over her face. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to dream of something more, of a life where she wasn't invisible, where she wasn't defined by her apron and broom. But reality always called her back. With a sigh, Maria picked up her basket and headed toward the east wing, where another day of polishing, dusting, and scrubbing awaited her. Little did she know, today would mark the beginning of a journey that would unravel not just the secrets of the Aldridge estate, but the mysteries of her own life as well. The attic was not a place Maria ventured often. Its steep, narrow stairs creaked ominously, and the heavy door at the top stuck in its frame, as if it resisted being opened after years of disuse. But that morning, her list of chores included cleaning out the space, a task assigned sparingly due to the dusty, cluttered nature of the room. Armed with a bucket of cleaning supplies and a determined spirit, Maria climbed the stairs, her steps echoing in the silent house. The attic smelled of aged wood and mildew, with beams of sunlight cutting through the dust floating in the air. Stacks of forgotten boxes and furniture covered in white sheets were crammed into every corner. Maria pulled back a sheet, revealing an ornate chest that had clearly been out of use for decades. The brass lock was tarnished, its key nowhere to be seen. Curious, she knelt down and gave the chest lid a gentle push. To her surprise, it creaked open, the lock long broken. Inside, the chest held a trove of objects that spoke of a different era. Maria carefully sifted through old letters, dried flowers pressed between the pages of a book, and a silk scarf so fragile it threatened to tear under her touch. She couldn't help but marvel at the items, wondering who had left them behind and why. Beneath the letters, buried under layers of fabric, her fingers brushed something cold and metallic. She pulled it out and held it up to the light. A delicate gold locket, its surface engraved with a pattern of intricate swirls. The craftsmanship was beautiful, and though the gold had dulled with age, the locket felt like it held a piece of someone's heart within it. Maria opened it carefully, her breath catching when she saw the small, faded photograph inside. The image was simple yet captivating. A young woman with dark, kind eyes stood beside a man with a confident smile. Something about the woman struck Maria deeply. The shape of her face, the curve of her smile, it all felt oddly familiar. Maria's brow furrowed as she stared at the picture. Could it be her imagination? Or did she resemble the woman in the photograph? Her thoughts raced as she turned the locket over in her hands. There were no names, no dates, nothing to hint at who the couple might have been or why the locket had been hidden away. Still, the woman's face lingered in her mind, stirring feelings she couldn't quite place. Maria sat back on her heels, letting her gaze wander around the attic. She tried to picture the life that had once filled the items stored here. The books that had been read, the letters that had been written with care, and this locket, which must have once been treasured by its owner. Who had it belonged to? Why had it been hidden? And why did the woman in the photograph look so much like her? The locket's hinge creaked softly as Maria closed it and slipped it into her pocket. She knew she shouldn't keep it, but she couldn't bear to leave it behind. Something about the locket felt significant, as though it were meant to find her. It was more than a trinket. It felt like a clue, though to what, Maria couldn't say. As she descended the attic stairs, Maria's mind buzzed with questions. Should she ask Mr. Aldridge about it? Would he even know anything about a long-forgotten locket? She hesitated, unsure if her employer would appreciate her prying into the past. He was a private man, and though she had worked in his house for years, she knew little about him beyond what the other staff whispered. That he'd been a loving husband before his wife's tragic passing, and that he rarely spoke of his family. That evening, as Maria sat in her small room, tucked away in the servants' quarters, she turned the locket over and over in her hands. The photograph inside seemed to call to her, urging her to uncover the story it held. After much deliberation, she made a decision. The locket wasn't hers to keep, and it didn't belong in a dusty attic. She would give it to Mr. Aldridge. Perhaps he could tell her more about it, or at the very least, she could return something of value to its rightful place. The next morning, Maria carried the locket with her as she went about her duties. It felt like a weight in her pocket, small but significant. Her hands trembled slightly as she prepared Mr. Aldridge's tea, rehearsing in her mind how she would bring it up. When she finally entered his study, the locket hidden in her apron, her nerves were nearly overwhelming. She didn't know it yet, but her simple act of returning the locket would set off a chain of events that would change her life forever. Maria stood outside the door to Mr. Aldridge's study, the locket clutched tightly in her hand. Her heart raced as she debated what to say. She wasn't used to addressing him outside the formal boundaries of her duties, and she feared he might view her gesture as an intrusion. But something about the locket, the familiarity of the woman's face, the strange pull it had over her, compelled her to follow through. Taking a steadying breath, Maria knocked lightly. "Come in," came the familiar voice, cool and distant as ever. Maria pushed the heavy door open to reveal Mr. Aldridge seated at his desk. The room was dim, with only the soft glow of the afternoon sun filtering through the heavy curtains. Papers and ledgers were spread before him, but his attention was on the framed photograph of his late wife, as it so often was. "Your tea, sir," Maria said, placing the tray carefully on the edge of the desk. She hesitated, the locket burning in her pocket. Mr. Aldridge didn't look up immediately. "Thank you, Maria," he murmured, his tone distracted. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "There's something I found while cleaning the attic yesterday. I thought it might belong to you." He finally lifted his gaze, his brow furrowing at her unusual tone. Maria reached into her pocket, producing the locket with tentative hands. She held it out to him, her eyes watching for any sign of recognition. "I found this in an old chest," she explained softly. "I thought it might be important." The moment his eyes fell on the locket, the atmosphere in the room changed. Mr. Aldridge's entire body stiffened, his expression freezing as though he'd seen a ghost. He slowly reached out, his fingers brushing against hers as he took the locket. Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the attic, sir," Maria replied, startled by the sudden intensity in his voice. "It was in a chest with some old letters and belongings." Mr. Aldridge opened the locket with trembling hands. When he saw the photograph inside, his breath caught audibly. His thumb gently traced the faces of the couple in the picture, and for a moment, he seemed utterly lost, transported somewhere Maria couldn't follow. "Edward," he murmured, almost to himself. The name was spoken with a mixture of reverence and regret. "Sir?" Maria ventured, her curiosity outweighing her apprehension. He looked up at her, his usually guarded eyes now filled with something she couldn't quite place. Pain, perhaps, or longing. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, shaking his head slightly. "This belonged to someone very dear," he said finally, his voice tight. "Someone I thought was long forgotten." Maria hesitated, unsure whether to press further. "The woman in the photograph," she began, her voice soft. "She looks familiar. I thought. She reminded me of—" "It's not your concern," he interrupted sharply, his tone snapping back to the cold, distant one she knew so well. He closed the locket with a decisive click and set it down on his desk. Maria flinched at his tone, but she couldn't ignore the emotions she'd seen flash across his face. For a man as reserved as Mr. Aldridge, those fleeting moments of vulnerability felt significant, like glimpses behind a tightly closed door. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quietly, lowering her gaze. "I didn't mean to intrude. I only thought it might be important." Mr. Aldridge sighed, the sharpness in his demeanor softening just slightly. "You weren't wrong to bring it to me, Maria," he said, though his voice carried a weariness that hadn't been there before. "Thank you." She nodded and turned to leave, but as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Maria," he said, his tone softer now. "Did you find anything else in the chest? Letters, perhaps?" She paused, her hand on the doorknob. "There were some old letters and papers, sir," she said honestly, "but I didn't look through them too closely. They're still in the attic." "Very well," he said, his gaze drifting back to the locket on the desk. "That will be all for now." Maria left the room, her mind swirling with questions. Who was Edward? And why had the locket caused such a strong reaction in a man who rarely showed emotion? In the study, Mr. Aldridge sat back in his chair, the locket still in his hand. His thoughts were a whirlwind of memories, of his older brother Edward, of the forbidden love that had once shaken their family, and of the pain that had been buried for decades. The locket was more than a trinket. It was a reminder of a past he'd tried desperately to forget. But now, with the locket's unexpected return, that past was knocking on his door once more, and he knew it wouldn't be ignored for long. The attic felt different when Maria returned. The dust motes swirling in the sunlight seemed less like harmless specks and more like remnants of hidden whispers, forgotten stories waiting to be uncovered. She climbed the steep stairs with a sense of purpose this time, her heart thrumming in her chest. The locket had stirred something deep within her, a curiosity she couldn't ignore, a need to know why it felt so significant. The chest sat exactly where she'd left it, its lid slightly ajar. Maria knelt beside it, her fingers trembling as she sifted through its contents once more. Beneath the silk scarf and dried flowers, she unearthed a stack of old letters, their edges yellowed and fragile with age. Each envelope was carefully sealed with wax, though some had been opened long ago. The handwriting was elegant, the ink faded but still legible. One name repeated on the envelopes: Edward Aldrich. Maria's breath caught. Edward, the name Mr. Aldrich had murmured when he saw the locket. This must have been his brother, the man in the photograph. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should proceed. It felt intrusive, but something compelled her to press on. Gently, she picked up one of the letters and unfolded it. The words on the page were intimate and filled with emotion, a love letter written in a tone that was both passionate and desperate. As Maria read, she realized the letter wasn't addressed to a woman of wealth or status, as she might have expected, but to someone who seemed more like herself, a maid, perhaps, or someone else in service at the estate. "My dearest Evelyn," the letter began, "the world may deem us foolish, but I would forsake all the riches and privileges of my family for the chance to be with you. Your laughter, your kindness, they have given me a happiness I never thought possible. Yet I fear that my parents will never accept what we share. They have made their opinions clear. They see only station and status, not the heart. But know this, my love for you will never waver. No matter what comes, you will always have my heart." Maria's hands trembled as she finished reading. Evelyn, that was her mother's name. Could it be? Could Edward Aldrich, the man in the letter, have been writing to her mother? The possibility sent a jolt through her. She carefully placed the letter aside and reached for another. This one was shorter, written hastily and with far less elegance. The tone was urgent, almost frantic. "Evelyn, my love, we cannot stay here. My parents have discovered us, and they are furious. My father is threatening to send you away. I cannot let that happen, but I fear there is little I can do to stop them. Meet me in the garden at midnight. We will find a way, I promise you." Maria's pulse quickened. The letters painted a picture of a forbidden romance, one that had clearly been met with resistance from the Aldrich family. But what had happened? Why had her mother never spoken of Edward or this part of her life? And why had the locket and these letters been hidden away? As Maria continued searching, she found more items buried deeper in the chest. There was a delicate hairpin, intricately designed with tiny pearls, and a photograph of Evelyn standing alone in the garden. She looked younger than Maria had ever seen her face radiant with joy. Clutched in her hands was the very same locket Maria had discovered the day before. The photograph made Maria's chest tighten with emotion. It was one thing to hear stories of her mother's past, but to see her this way, alive, happy, and vibrant, was something else entirely. Tears pricked her eyes as she gently set the photograph aside. Her hands brushed against something harder at the bottom of the chest. Pulling it out, she discovered a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was embossed with the initials EA, and inside were pages filled with Edward's handwriting. The entries were sporadic, but one near the back caught Maria's attention. "August 3rd, Father has made his decision. Evelyn is to be sent away immediately. I begged and pleaded with him, but he would not yield. He says our family name must remain untarnished, that we must maintain appearances at all costs. Evelyn doesn't know yet. How can I tell her? She carries my child, our child, and yet I am powerless to protect her. I have failed her in every way." Maria's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. A child. Could it be? Could Edward have been her father? The timeline fit. Her mother had always been secretive about Maria's origins, claiming only that her father had passed away before she was born. But if Edward Aldrich was her father, why had her mother kept this part of her life hidden? Why had she left the estate and never returned? The weight of the discovery settled heavily on Maria's shoulders. She looked around the attic, the once cluttered space, now feeling alive with the echoes of the past. This wasn't just a story about her mother and Edward. It was her story, too. She needed answers, and the only person who might have them was the man sitting in his study downstairs, Mr. Aldrich. Clutching the journal and the letters, Maria descended the attic stairs with trembling hands. The locket had been the first thread, and now she was beginning to unravel the tapestry of secrets that had been buried in the shadows of the Aldrich estate for decades. But what would Mr. Aldrich say when she confronted him? Would he confirm the truth, or would he try to bury it once more? Maria didn't know, but she was determined to find out. In the quiet sanctuary of his study, Mr. Aldridge sat at his desk, the locket still resting in his hand. The delicate chain slipped between his fingers as he turned it over, the engraved pattern gleaming faintly in the dim light. The sight of it had cracked something within him, a carefully constructed wall that had stood for decades. Memories he had buried deep now rose to the surface, unbidden and unstoppable. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to drift back to the days when the estate had been filled with life. His older brother, Edward, had always been the center of attention, a man of charm and wit, adored by their parents and admired by everyone who crossed his path. Edward had been everything that Mr. Aldridge, with his quiet demeanor and reserved nature, was not. Yet beneath his brother's easy charisma was a defiant streak that often clashed with the rigid expectations of their family. The first time Edward had introduced Evelyn, Mr. Aldridge had felt the tension in the room. Evelyn was beautiful, with a radiant smile and a warm presence that could disarm even the coldest of hearts. She wasn't like the women their parents had paraded before Edward, those with titles and wealth who fit neatly into their world of privilege. Evelyn was different. She was a maid, her station marked by the simplicity of her dress and the quiet humility in her demeanor. But it was clear from the way Edward looked at her that she had captured his heart. Mr. Aldridge had watched from the sidelines as the relationship unfolded in secret. Edward had always been reckless, but there was a passion in his love for Evelyn that even Mr. Aldridge couldn't dismiss. They would steal moments together in the gardens or whisper in the corners of the estate, believing no one was watching. But of course, nothing went unnoticed for long in a house ruled by such rigid formality. When their parents discovered the relationship, the fallout was swift and merciless. Mr. Aldridge could still recall the shouting matches in his father's study, the way his mother's face had turned ashen with disbelief. Their father, a man obsessed with legacy and reputation, had declared the relationship an affront to the Aldridge name. Edward was forbidden from seeing Evelyn, and she was threatened with immediate dismissal if she didn't comply. But Edward had never been one to follow orders, especially when it came to matters of the heart. He defied their father at every turn, sneaking away to meet Evelyn despite the growing consequences. Mr. Aldridge, younger and quieter, had tried to reason with him once, begging him to think of what would happen if he continued down this path. "She's everything to me," Edward had said, his voice filled with desperation. "You wouldn't understand, Thomas. You've never felt this way about anyone." Mr. Aldridge had stood there, unable to respond. Edward was right. He hadn't experienced the kind of love that drove someone to defy everything. But he had seen the toll it was taking on his brother, the growing cracks in his otherwise confident demeanor. Edward had always been larger than life, but in those moments, he seemed vulnerable in a way Mr. Aldridge had never seen before. The breaking point had come one stormy evening. Their father had announced that Evelyn would be dismissed the following morning, and Edward had pleaded with him to reconsider. The argument had escalated into a shouting match, with Edward finally storming out of the room. Mr. Aldridge had found him later that night, standing in the rain by the garden gate, clutching the locket that Evelyn had given him. "They're sending her away," Edward had said, his voice barely audible over the downpour. "And there's nothing I can do to stop them." Mr. Aldridge had never known what to say in moments like those. He had always been a quiet one, the observer. All he could do was place a hand on Edward's shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. The next morning, Evelyn was gone, and Edward was never the same. He became withdrawn, his once vibrant spirit dulled by the loss. He continued to rebel against their parents in other ways, drinking and gambling recklessly, but it was clear that his heart had been broken beyond repair. The final blow had come a year later when Edward died in a riding accident, his horse spooked by a sudden storm. Mr. Aldridge had always wondered if it had truly been an accident or if Edward's grief had driven him to recklessness that day. Opening his eyes, Mr. Aldridge looked down at the locket once more. It had been Evelyn's, a token of the love she and Edward had shared. Seeing it again after all these years felt like a ghost from the past had walked into the room. He had spent decades trying to forget, to push aside the pain and guilt of what had happened. But now, with the locket in his hand, He couldn't escape the truth any longer. And then there was Maria. When she had handed him the locket, he had felt a strange unease, a nagging sense of familiarity he couldn't quite place. Her resemblance to Evelyn was undeniable, though he hadn't dared say it aloud. Could it be possible? Could Maria somehow be connected to his brother's tragic love story? The thought unsettled him deeply. If Maria was Evelyn's daughter, then she was family. And if she was family, what responsibility did he bear for the life she had been forced to live? The locket had reopened a door he had long kept shut, and now he had no choice but to confront what lay beyond it. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, Maria descended the attic stairs with trembling hands, her mind swirling with questions. The letters, the journal, and the locket painted a picture of a forbidden love, but the details were still shrouded in mystery. The idea that her mother, Evelyn, had been involved with Edward Aldrich, a man from such a different world, felt both incredible and heartbreaking. And the mention of a child in Edward's journal. Could it be her? Could she really be the child he had written about? The thought sent a wave of confusion and emotion through her. She needed answers, but she knew she couldn't find them alone. The truth was locked in the memories of those who had been there, people who had served the Aldrich family long enough to remember what had happened all those years ago. That evening, after her duties were done, Maria made her way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Hensley, the head cook, was cleaning up after dinner. The older woman had been with the Aldrich family for decades and was known for her no-nonsense demeanor. She rarely spoke about the past, but Maria hoped that with the right approach, she might be willing to share something. Mrs. Hensley, Maria began hesitantly, twisting her apron nervously. May I ask you something about the families? The cook looked up from her work, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. What kind of something, child? You know it's best not to stick your nose where it doesn't belong. I know, Maria said quickly. It's just, I found something in the attic. Some old letters, a journal. They mentioned Edward Aldrich and someone named Evelyn. She hesitated, then added softly, that was my mother's name. Mrs. Hensley's hands froze mid-scrub, the cloth in her hand dripping soapy water onto the floor. She turned slowly to face Maria, her expression unreadable. Your mother's name was Evelyn? She repeated, her voice quieter now. Maria nodded. I think she might have worked here. A long time ago. Mrs. Hensley studied her for a long moment, her gaze softening as she seemed to weigh her response. Finally, she sighed and set the cloth down. Come sit, she said, motioning to a worn wooden stool near the table. Maria obeyed, her heart pounding with anticipation. I've worked in this house for over 40 years, Mrs. Hensley began, her voice taking on a somber tone. I've seen more than my share of heartache and scandal. But what happened with Miss Evelyn and Mr. Edward? She shook her head. It was one of the worst. Maria leaned forward, hanging on her every word. Your mother came to this house when she was just a girl, not much older than you are now. Sweet as could be, always had a smile for everyone. She worked hard, but she had a way about her that made people take notice. Mr. Edward certainly did. Mrs. Hensley gave a sad chuckle. He fell for her faster than a summer storm, and she for him. But of course, it wasn't meant to be. Why not? Maria asked, though she already suspected the answer. Mrs. Hensley gave her a knowing look. You know why, child? The Aldriches were a family of wealth and reputation. Their kind didn't marry maids, no matter how much they might love them. Mr. Edward tried, though, fought tooth and nail against his parents to keep her here, but they wouldn't have it. They sent your mother away, and it broke his heart. Broke hers, too. Maria's chest tightened. And the child, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hensley's face softened further. I wondered about that when you came here. There's always been something about you, Maria. The way you look, the way you carry yourself. You reminded me of your mother when she was young. I didn't want to pry, but I thought it might be possible. She paused, her voice heavy with emotion. Your mother was expecting when she left. She didn't tell many people, but I knew. She came to me the night before she was sent away, crying her heart out. She didn't want to leave, but she didn't have a choice. Maria's eyes filled with tears. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. and the truth was both exhilarating and devastating. Her mother had been in love, deeply enough to risk everything, but had been torn away from the man she loved and the life they had dreamed of building together. And now, decades later, Maria was standing in the same house, unknowingly retracing her mother's steps. "Why didn't she ever tell me?" Maria murmured, more to herself than to Mrs. Hensley. She never talked about this place or about Edward. Mrs. Hensley placed a comforting hand on Maria's shoulder. Maybe she thought it was better that way. Sometimes the past hurts too much to bring back, even for the ones we love. Maria nodded, though her heart ached with the weight of all she had learned. She stayed with Mrs. Hensley for a while longer, listening to more stories of her mother's time at the estate, piecing together the life she had never known. When she finally returned to her room that night, Maria sat on her small bed, the locket and letters spread before her. The truth was out, but it felt like only the beginning. She and the hints of a child raised more questions than they answered. And the idea that she could be that child, that she might belong to the Aldrich family, both thrilled and terrified her. She couldn't keep silent anymore. The man who might hold the final piece of the truth was Mr. Aldrich, and Maria knew she had to confront him, no matter how intimidating the prospect felt. The morning came too soon, and as she carried out her chores, the weight of her decision pressed on her. When the clock struck 11, she found herself standing outside the heavy oak door to his study, her hands trembling. She knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet hall. "Come in," Mr. Aldrich's voice called, as measured and distant as always. Maria stepped inside, clutching the journal to her chest. Mr. Aldrich was seated at his desk, reviewing papers, his pen scratching against the page. He looked up, his brow furrowing slightly at the sight of her. "Maria," he said, setting the pen down. "What is it? Is something wrong?" Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "Sir, I need to ask you something. About my mother." His posture stiffened ever so slightly. "Your mother?" he repeated, his tone careful. "What about her?" Maria took a step closer and placed the journal on his desk. "I found this in the attic," she said, her voice trembling. "It belonged to Edward, and it mentions Evelyn, my mother. He loved her. They were in love." A flicker of emotion crossed Mr. Aldrich's face, something between sorrow and unease. He opened the journal slowly, his fingers brushing the edges of the pages. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Evelyn was a kind woman," he said. "Your mother had a light about her that drew people in, Edward most of all. But it was complicated." Maria felt her frustration rise. "It wasn't just complicated," she said, her voice sharp. "She was sent away. Edward wrote about it. He said your father forced her to leave, that she was carrying his child." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Mr. Aldrich's gaze snapped up to hers, and for a moment his carefully controlled demeanor cracked. "Where did you read that?" he asked, his voice low and tense. "In his journal," Maria replied, gesturing to the worn book on the desk. "You knew, didn't you? You knew all this time, and you said nothing." Mr. Aldrich let out a slow breath and leaned back in his chair. "I suspected," he admitted, his voice filled with weariness. "The resemblance, it was hard to ignore. But what would you have had me do? Bring up a past that caused nothing but pain? That would not have helped anyone, least of all you." Maria's hands clenched into fists. "But it's my past," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's my mother's story, and I have a right to know it. She deserved better than to be cast out and forgotten. Edward deserved better too." For a moment, Mr. Aldrich was silent. He stared at the journal, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "You're right," he said, his voice quieter now. "You do deserve to know. Meet me in the library after supper. There are things I need to find first." Maria hesitated, then nodded. As she left the room, her emotions were a whirlwind: anger, sadness, and a strange sense of hope. The truth was closer than ever, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it would change everything. The library was a place Maria rarely entered. Its tall shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, crammed with leather-bound books that exuded an air of timeless wisdom. The scent of aged paper hung in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of wood polish. She stood by the doorway, her hands clasped tightly, waiting for Mr. Aldrich to join her. When he arrived, he carried a small stack of documents, his expression unusually somber. He set them down on the heavy oak table in the center of the room and gestured for Maria to sit. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "This," Mr. Aldrich began, picking up the topmost document, "is your mother's employment record." He handed it to Maria, who took it hesitantly. The paper was old, the edges yellowed, but the handwriting was precise and neat. It confirmed that Evelyn had been employed as a maid at the Aldrich estate, starting when she was barely 18. "She worked here for 6 years," Mr. Aldrich continued, his voice heavy. "She was a diligent worker, well-liked by most of the staff. But it was her relationship with my brother Edward that changed everything." Maria nodded, her throat tight. She had pieced much of this together already, but hearing it from Mr. Aldrich gave it a weight she couldn't ignore. "Edward," he said, his voice softening as he spoke his brother's name, "was the kind of man who lived with his heart first. He loved passionately, recklessly, and when he fell for Evelyn, he was willing to risk everything for her. But my parents," he paused, his lips pressing into a thin line, "they were not so forgiving." He reached for another document, this one a letter bearing the Aldrich family crest. "This was written by my father," he said, handing it to Maria. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the harsh words. "Edward, your dalliance with this girl has gone far enough. It is unbecoming of someone of your station and a disgrace to the Aldrich name. I have taken steps to ensure she is removed from the estate at once. Do not let your foolish emotions cloud your judgment. You have a duty to this family, and it is high time you remember it." Maria's hands trembled as she held the letter. The cruelty in its tone was unmistakable. "You wrote this about my mother?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Aldrich nodded grimly. "Our father was a man of unyielding principles. To him, reputation and legacy were everything. When he discovered the relationship between Edward and Evelyn, he acted swiftly and without mercy." Maria set the letter down, her heart pounding. "Edward knew she was pregnant," she said, her voice shaking. "He wrote about it in his journal. He said he wanted to protect her." Mr. Aldrich's expression softened. "He did. He begged our father to let her stay, but it was no use. Evelyn was sent away. Edward was devastated. He tried to find her, to bring her back, but by then, she had disappeared. Our father had made sure of it." The room fell silent, the weight of the story pressing down on both of them. Maria struggled to process the enormity of what she had learned. Her mother's life had been torn apart by the whims of a powerful family, her love for Edward dismissed as a mere dalliance. And Edward, he had loved her deeply, but had been powerless to save her. "There's one more thing," Mr. Aldrich said after a long pause. He reached for the final document in the stack and handed it to Maria. It was a birth certificate, the paper fragile but intact. Her eyes widened as she read the details. The certificate bore her name, Maria Evelyn Carter. Her mother's name was listed as Evelyn Carter, but the father's name was written in bold, unmistakable letters, Edward Aldrich. Maria's breath caught. Seeing it in writing made the truth undeniable. Edward was her father. She was not just a maid working at the Aldrich estate. She was part of its bloodline, a descendant of the very family that had cast her mother out. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at Mr. Aldrich. "You knew," she said, her voice trembling. "You knew this, didn't you?" "I suspected," he admitted, his voice low. "But I didn't have confirmation until I found that document in the archives this afternoon. I wanted to believe it wasn't true. Not because of who you are, Maria, but because of the pain it would bring you." Maria clutched the birth certificate tightly, a storm of emotions swirling within her. Anger at the injustice done to her mother, sadness for the love she had lost, and a strange sense of belonging she had never felt before. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Aldrich leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Now," he said, "we figure out how to move forward. You have a rightful place in this family, Maria, whether you choose to embrace it or not. But I will not let my parents' mistakes dictate your future. Not anymore." For the first time, Maria saw something in Mr. Aldrich's eyes that she hadn't before, a flicker of compassion, of humanity. She nodded slowly, her heart still heavy, but filled with a newfound determination. She would not let her mother's story be forgotten, and she would not let the Aldridge name define her without honoring the legacy of the woman who had endured so much. The truth had finally come to light, but Maria knew her journey was far from over. Maria sat alone in her small room that night, the birth certificate clutched in her hands. Her eyes traced the bold, undeniable letters of her father's name, Edward Aldridge. No matter how many times she read it, the truth refused to settle easily in her mind. She was not just a maid working at the estate. She was an Aldridge by blood, the child of a forbidden love that had been buried beneath decades of secrecy. The emotions churned within her like a storm. Anger at the injustice her mother had faced. Sadness for the love her parents had shared, stolen by forces beyond their control. And a strange, aching grief for Edward, a father she had never known. What would he have been like? Would he have been proud of her? Or was she just another casualty of the Aldridge family's unyielding need to protect their reputation? A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She wiped at her eyes quickly, trying to compose herself. When she opened the door, she found Mr. Aldridge standing there, his expression as tired and conflicted as she felt. "May I come in?" he asked softly. Maria nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. He looked around the modest room, his gaze lingering on the small, simple furnishings that stood in stark contrast to the grandeur of the estate. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, as though seeing the life she had lived here for the first time. "I wanted to check on you," he said finally. "I know this must be a lot to take in." Maria closed the door and turned to face him, the birth certificate still clutched in her hand. "You think?" she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I've spent my whole life wondering about my father, and now I find out he was Edward Aldridge. That he loved my mother, but your family," she stopped herself, her emotions threatening to spill over. "Your family destroyed everything." Mr. Aldridge flinched at her words, a shadow of guilt crossing his face. "You're right," he said quietly. "My parents were cruel. They valued their reputation more than they valued their own son's happiness. And I didn't do anything to stop it. I was young, but that's no excuse. I stayed silent when I should have spoken up." Maria studied him, her anger wavering at the raw honesty in his voice. "You didn't send her away," she said after a moment. "But you didn't help her either." "No," he admitted, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my place to intervene, that it was between Edward and our parents. But I see now that my silence made me complicit in their cruelty." The room fell silent, the weight of their shared grief hanging between them. Maria turned away, her fingers brushing the edge of the small dresser where she kept her few belongings. "I keep thinking about my mother," she said softly. "She must have been so scared, leaving this place, knowing she was pregnant and alone. She never talked about it. Not to me, not to anyone. I always thought she was just being private, but now I think it was because it hurt too much." Mr. Aldridge nodded slowly. "Evelyn was one of the strongest people I've ever known," he said. "To endure what she did, I can't imagine. And Edward, he wasn't the same after she left. He tried to move on, but he never did. My parents broke him too." Maria turned back to face him, tears glistening in her eyes. "Then why did they do it? How could they be so cruel?" "Because they were afraid," Mr. Aldridge said, his voice laced with bitterness. "Afraid of what people would say, of how it would reflect on the Aldridge name. To them, reputation was everything. They didn't care who they hurt as long as the family remained untarnished." Maria shook her head, anger flaring again. "And look what it got them. Edward is gone. My mother suffered her whole life. And now I'm standing here trying to make sense of it all." Mr. Aldridge stepped closer, his gaze steady. "I can't change what happened," he said, "but I can do what I should have done years ago. You're part of this family, Maria. Whether you want to claim that or not, it's your right. And if there's anything I can do to help you, anything at all, I will." Maria stared at him, her emotions swirling. Part of her wanted to scream, to rage at him for his family's failings. But another part saw the man before her, not the cold, distant figure she had always known, but someone who carried his own burden of guilt and sorrow. For the first time, she saw him not as her employer, but as her uncle. "I don't know what I want," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't even know who I am anymore." "You're Maria," he said gently. "You're Evelyn's daughter, and you're stronger than you realize." The words brought a fresh wave of tears to her eyes. She sat down on the edge of the bed, clutching the birth certificate to her chest. Mr. Aldridge hesitated for a moment before taking a seat in the chair across from her. They sat in silence for a long time, the enormity of the truth settling over them like a heavy blanket. For Maria, it was the weight of a history she had never known, the burden of a legacy she hadn't asked for. For Mr. Aldridge, it was the guilt of a life spent standing by while others suffered. But in that shared silence, something shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. A fragile thread of understanding began to form between them, one that might one day grow into something stronger. "I don't know where to go from here," Maria said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then we'll figure it out together," Mr. Aldridge replied. "One step at a time," and for the first time, Maria felt a glimmer of hope amid the chaos. A sense that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this after all. Maria stood in the middle of the library, the room that had revealed so many truths and broken open her world. The birth certificate sat on the table, a tangible reminder of who she was and the legacy she had unwittingly stepped into. Across from her, Mr. Aldridge sat quietly, his hands folded, his face drawn with both guilt and resolution. The weight of their shared silence was suffocating. It was Maria who finally broke it, her voice steady but tinged with a tremor. "You said I have a place in this family," she began. "But what does that even mean? For so long I've been just Maria, a maid. And now you're telling me I'm part of the Aldridge family? That I have a claim to something I never even knew existed?" Mr. Aldridge nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers. "It means you have rights, Maria. Rights to the estate, to the inheritance Edward would have wanted for his child. But it's more than that. It's about acknowledging the truth. My parents tried to erase what happened, but you're proof that they couldn't. You deserve to be recognized." Maria's chest tightened. She didn't know what she had expected to hear, but his words filled her with a mixture of anger and confusion. "Recognized?" she repeated. "You think giving me a piece of this estate will fix everything? That it'll make up for what happened to my mother?" "No," Mr. Aldridge said quickly, his voice firm. "I know it won't. Nothing can change what she endured or bring back Edward. But this isn't about fixing the past. It's about making sure the mistakes of this family aren't repeated. About giving you what was always meant to be yours." Maria looked away, her thoughts a storm of conflicting emotions. A part of her wanted to reject everything he was offering, to distance herself from the family that had caused her mother so much pain. But another part, the part that carried her mother's strength and resilience, told her to stand her ground. If she walked away, she would be letting the Aldridge family's cruelty win. "What would it even look like?" she asked after a long pause. "If I stayed, if I accepted this, what happens then?" Mr. Aldridge leaned forward, his expression earnest. "It's up to you, Maria. You've already shown that you're not afraid to fight for the truth. If you want, you could take on a role here. Help shape the future of this estate. Give it a purpose beyond the wealth and privilege it's always stood for. I would support you in that, in whatever way you choose." Maria narrowed her eyes. "And what if I don't want to be part of this family? What if I don't want anything to do with the Aldridge name?" He hesitated, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Then that's your choice," he said quietly. "But whatever you decide, know this. You're not just a maid, Maria. You never were. You're part of something bigger, whether you embrace it or not." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Maria stared at the birth certificate again, her mind racing. She thought of her mother, the sacrifices she had made to protect her, the love she must have carried for Edward even as she left the estate behind. Maria had spent her whole life wondering about her father, and now she had her answer. But the cost of that truth was higher than she could have ever imagined. "I don't know if I want this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just an inheritance or a name. It's everything. The pain, the history, the responsibility. I'm not sure I'm ready for that." Mr. Aldridge nodded, his gaze steady. I understand, and I don't expect you to decide right now. Take your time, Maria. Whatever you choose, I'll respect it." She looked at him, surprised by the softness in his voice. For the first time, she saw not the distant, cold employer she had always known, but a man trying to make amends for a lifetime of silence. It didn't erase the past, but it was a start. "I need to think," she said, finally standing. Her hands trembled as she gathered the documents, but her resolve felt stronger. "I need to figure out what's next, for me, not for the Aldridge family." Mr. Aldridge rose as well, his expression thoughtful. "Of course," he said, "but remember, you don't have to figure it out alone. You have people here who care about you, more than you realize." Maria nodded, though she wasn't ready to accept his words fully. As she left the library, the weight of her decision pressed heavily on her shoulders. She was no longer just a maid in the Aldridge estate. She was part of its story, its legacy, and whether she liked it or not, she had the power to shape what that legacy would become. In the quiet of her room later that night, Maria sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit gardens below. She thought of her mother, of Edward, of the life they had dreamed of but never had the chance to live. And she thought of herself, of the choices she now faced and the future that lay before her. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what it might look like to embrace her place in the Aldridge family, to turn the estate into something meaningful, something her mother would have been proud of. The thought scared her, but it also filled her with a strange, unfamiliar hope. "This is my story now," she whispered to herself, her fingers brushing the locket around her neck. "And I'm not going to let it end the way theirs did." The turning point had come, and Maria knew there was no going back. Whatever path she chose, it would be hers, and hers alone. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Aldridge estate, casting warm light over the grand hall. Maria stood at the foot of the staircase, gazing up at the portraits of the Aldridge family that lined the walls. Their faces, frozen in time, seemed to watch her with a silent judgment. For so long, she had felt small in their presence, as if they were reminders of the barriers that separated her world from theirs. But now, she saw them differently. She wasn't just a maid standing in their shadow. She was one of them, whether she chose to embrace it or not. That realization had been both empowering and overwhelming. Over the past few days, Maria had wrestled with the truth of her heritage and what it meant for her future. She thought of her mother's sacrifices, Edward's love, and the injustices that had shaped their lives. Her mother's strength ran through her veins, and with that strength, Maria began to see a path forward, one that would honor the past while forging something new. She found Mr. Aldridge in the study, his usual place of refuge. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable but expectant. "I've made a decision," Maria said, her voice steady. She took a deep breath before continuing. "I'll stay, but I don't want to live as a figurehead or some hidden piece of the Aldridge legacy. If I'm going to be part of this family, it has to mean something." Mr. Aldridge set down the paper he had been holding and gestured for her to sit. "Go on," he said, his tone calm but curious. Maria sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly. "This estate has been a symbol of wealth and power for so long, but it's also been a place of pain, for my mother, for Edward, and even for you. I don't want that to continue. If I'm going to stay, I want to transform this estate into something better. A place that helps people, not just a monument to privilege." Mr. Aldridge leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing in thought. "That's a bold idea," he said after a moment. "What exactly do you have in mind?" Maria hesitated, her thoughts swirling as she tried to put her vision into words. "I want to open the estate to the community," she said finally. "Use the unused rooms to house families in need. Create programs to help people get back on their feet. Maybe even turn part of the land into a garden that can provide food for those who can't afford it." Mr. Aldridge raised an eyebrow. "You want to turn the Aldridge estate into a sanctuary?" "Yes," Maria said firmly. "A sanctuary. This place has been a fortress for so long, a symbol of exclusion. I want to change that. I want it to stand for something good." For a long moment, Mr. Aldridge was silent, his gaze fixed on her as if he were seeing her for the first time. Then, slowly, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "You remind me of Edward," he said quietly. He was always full of grand ideas, too, always wanting to make the world a better place. Maria felt a pang of emotion at his words, but pushed it aside. "This isn't just about Edward," she said. "It's about my mother, too. She spent her life serving this house, even after it turned its back on her. This is a chance to honor her, to give meaning to everything she went through." Mr. Aldridge nodded, his smile fading as his expression turned serious. "I can't undo what my parents did," he said, "but I can support you in this. If this is what you want, Maria, then I'll help you make it happen." Relief and determination surged through Maria. "Thank you," she said softly. "I won't let you down." The transformation of the estate was not an easy task. It began with clearing out the unused rooms, many of which had been sealed for years, their contents forgotten and gathering dust. Maria worked tirelessly alongside the staff, repurposing old furniture and breathing life into spaces that had once been neglected. Her hands were blistered and sore by the end of each day, but the work filled her with a sense of purpose she had never known. Word spread quickly through the nearby villages about the changes taking place at the Aldridge estate. At first, people were skeptical, unsure of what to make of the wealthy estate opening its doors to those in need. But as Maria began to meet with local families, explaining her vision and inviting them to see the changes for themselves, the skepticism began to fade. One of the first families to move in was a widow and her 2 young children, who had been living in a cramped, drafty room above a tavern. Maria welcomed them personally, showing them to a warm, freshly painted suite of rooms. The look of relief and gratitude on the mother's face was all the validation Maria needed to know she was on the right path. The gardens, too, underwent a transformation. What had once been a space reserved for ornamental flowers and displays of wealth was now replanted with vegetables, fruits, and herbs. Maria worked side by side with local volunteers, many of whom had been struggling to make ends meet. Together, they turned the soil, sowed seeds, and watched as the first shoots of green broke through the earth, a symbol of new beginnings for everyone involved. Mr. Aldridge, for his part, kept his word. He met with lawyers and advisors to ensure the legalities of the estate's transformation were handled properly. Though he remained somewhat reserved, he seemed lighter, as if Maria's vision had lifted a burden he had carried for years. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Maria stood at the edge of the garden, watching as children played in the soft twilight. The sound of their laughter filled the air, mingling with the chirping of crickets. Beside her, Mr. Aldridge stood silently, his hands clasped behind his back. "You've done something remarkable here," he said after a long pause. "I think Edward and Evelyn would be proud." Maria smiled, her heart swelling with both pride and gratitude. "It's not just me," she said. "This is their legacy, too. And yours, if you want it to be." Mr. Aldridge nodded slowly. "I do," he said. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like this house is alive again. And that's because of you." Maria looked out at the estate, the place that had once been a symbol of pain and loss. Now it was something entirely new, a place of hope, of healing, of second chances. And as she stood there, she knew she had made the right choice. Her mother's strength had carried her here, but it was her own resolve that would carry her forward. The Aldridge estate had been redefined, not just in purpose, but in spirit. And Maria, no longer just a maid, had found her place within it. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the transformation of the Aldridge estate had breathed life into its halls, but it also unearthed memories and emotions that could no longer be ignored. For Maria, the journey of reclaiming her family's story was far from over. Amid the laughter of children playing in the gardens and the warmth of families finding refuge in the estate's once empty rooms, Maria knew there was one more task she needed to face: finding forgiveness, not just for the Aldridge family, but for herself. One crisp morning, Maria found herself in the drawing room, seated opposite Mr. Aldridge. The room had always seemed cold to her, its opulent furniture and gilded mirrors serving as a reminder of the estate's rigid and unyielding past. But today, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows made it feel warmer, less imposing. "I wanted to talk," Maria began, her voice steady but soft. About everything, about my mother, about Edward, about what happened. Mr. Aldridge nodded, folding his hands in his lap. I've been waiting for this conversation, he admitted. But I wasn't sure if you'd ever want to have it. Maria hesitated, searching for the right words. I've spent weeks thinking about the past, she said. About how much pain this house has caused, not just to my mother, but to you, to Edward, even to me. And I've been angry. Angry at your parents, at this family, and at you. Mr. Aldridge flinched, though he tried to hide it. I deserve that, he said quietly. I was a coward, Maria. I stood by and let my parents destroy lives because I was too afraid to challenge them. I can't undo that, no matter how much I wish I could. His admission surprised her, not because of the words themselves, but because of the raw vulnerability in his voice. For so long, she had seen him as a distant, stoic figure, a man more concerned with preserving his family's name than acknowledging its sins. But now, she saw the weight he carried, the regret etched into his face. You've changed, Maria said after a moment. Since I first came here, you've changed. I think my mother would have seen that in you. I think Edward would have too. Mr. Aldridge looked down at his hands, a faint, sad smile tugging at his lips. Edward was always the better man, he said. He had courage, passion, a sense of justice I could never match. He would have fought for Evelyn until his last breath, and in a way, he did. But I let them down. I let you down. Maria leaned forward, her voice firm but gentle. You didn't send her away, she said, and you didn't hide the truth from me when I came to you. You've helped me turn this estate into something my mother and Edward would be proud of. That doesn't erase the past, but it means something. Mr. Aldridge looked at her, his eyes glistening. Do you forgive me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria hesitated. Forgiveness was not something she could give lightly, not after everything her mother had endured. But as she looked at the man before her, she realized that holding on to anger would only keep her chained to the pain of the past. Letting go wasn't about excusing what had happened. It was about freeing herself to move forward. Yes, she said finally, her voice steady. I forgive you. A breath of relief escaped him, and for the first time, Maria saw tears in his eyes. Thank you, he said softly. That means more than you know. Later that day, Maria made her way to the garden, seeking the solace of the place her mother had loved most. She carried the locket in her hand, its weight a comforting reminder of the woman who had given her life and strength. She found a quiet bench beneath a blooming magnolia tree and sat, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves surrounding her. As she opened the locket, gazing at the photograph of her mother and Edward, a wave of emotion washed over her. She closed her eyes and let herself feel it all, the grief, the love, the hope. She thought of the sacrifices her mother had made to protect her, the courage Edward had shown in defying his family, and the legacy they had left behind. I forgive you too, she whispered, her voice carried away by the wind. For everything, and I'll carry your story forward. I promise. The weight in her chest lifted, replaced by a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't just for others. It was for herself too. By letting go of the anger and pain, she was making space for healing, for hope, for the future. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments of reconciliation. Mr. Aldridge became more involved in the estate's transformation, not as a figure of authority, but as a partner in Maria's vision. They worked side by side, planning new initiatives and meeting with families who would soon call the estate home. One evening, as they walked through the garden, Maria paused by a small stone marker she had placed beneath the magnolia tree. It bore her mother's name, along with a simple inscription, Evelyn Carter, a life of strength and love. I thought it was time she had a place here, Maria said, her voice steady. She deserves to be remembered. Mr. Aldridge nodded, his expression solemn. She does, he said, and so does Edward. I think they'd both be proud of what you've done. Maria smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. The past would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had found forgiveness, not just for the Aldridge family, but for herself. And in doing so, she had found the strength to move forward. The garden, once a place of secrets and sorrow, had become a space of healing and remembrance. And as Maria stood beneath the magnolia tree, the locket warm in her hand, she knew she was ready to embrace whatever came next. The estate's transformation was nearly complete, and its halls, once quiet and cold, now buzzed with life. The laughter of children echoed through the corridors. The aroma of fresh bread from the newly revitalized kitchens wafted through the air, and the gardens bloomed with an array of vegetables and flowers, tended by hands both old and young. For the first time in decades, the Aldridge estate felt alive, not as a monument to privilege, but as a haven for healing and renewal. For Maria, this new life at the estate was deeply fulfilling. Yet, amidst the joy, she felt a quiet, persistent ache, the sense that the story of the past still needed to be fully acknowledged. Her mother's strength and Edward's courage had been the foundation of this transformation, and it was time to give them the honor they deserved. One crisp morning, Maria stood in the garden beneath the magnolia tree, holding the locket in her hand. Beside her stood Mr. Aldridge, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched her in quiet contemplation. "I've been thinking," Maria began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, "about my mother and Edward. Everything we've done here, it's because of them, their love, their sacrifices. But I feel like we haven't truly recognized them yet." Mr. Aldridge nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he said. "They deserve more than just to be remembered in stories or journals. They deserve a place here, something permanent." Maria turned to him, a small but determined smile on her lips. "I'd like to create a memorial," she said. "Something that honors their love, their strength, and everything they stood for. Not just for them, but for everyone who comes here. A reminder that this estate is about second chances and the courage to fight for what matters." Mr. Aldridge's gaze softened, and he gave a small nod. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said. "How do you envision it?" Maria hesitated, her mind swirling with ideas. "I was thinking of placing it here," she said, gesturing to the magnolia tree. "This was my mother's favorite spot in the garden. Edward wrote about it in his journal. It's where they used to meet. It feels right." Beside the monument, a bench was installed, crafted from the wood of an old tree that had once stood in the estate's orchard. It was a place for reflection, where visitors could sit and take in the beauty of the garden while honoring the story that had made it all possible. The day of the memorial's unveiling arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon. The air was cool, the sky a brilliant shade of blue, and the garden was filled with the soft murmur of voices as families and volunteers gathered to witness the moment. Maria stood at the front of the group, the locket around her neck, her heart pounding as she prepared to speak. She glanced at Mr. Aldridge, who gave her a small, reassuring nod. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "Thank you all for being here today," Maria began, her voice carrying across the garden. "This estate has been through many changes, but at its heart, it has always been about people, their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. Today, we honor two people whose love and courage laid the foundation for everything we've built here." She paused, her gaze drifting to the magnolia tree. "My mother, Evelyn Carter, was a woman of incredible strength and kindness. She gave up everything for love and for me, enduring hardships that I can only imagine. Edward Aldridge, my father, was a man of passion and conviction who defied his family's expectations to follow his heart. Their love wasn't easy, but it was real, and it's because of them that this estate is what it is today." Maria's voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on. "This memorial is a tribute to their story, a reminder that love, courage, and resilience can overcome even the greatest of challenges. And it's a promise that their legacy will live on, not just in this estate, but in the lives of everyone who finds hope and healing here." A hush fell over the crowd as Maria stepped back, allowing Mr. Aldridge to pull away the cloth covering the monument. The polished stone glimmered in the sunlight, the inscription clear and elegant. There were murmurs of admiration, and some of the older volunteers wiped at their eyes, moved by the story they had come to know through Maria after the ceremony. Maria sat on the bench beneath the magnolia tree, her fingers brushing the locket around her neck. Mr. Aldridge joined her, his usually reserved expression softened with emotion. They would be proud of you, he said after a long silence. You've given their story a voice, a place. I never had the courage to do that. Maria turned to him, a faint smile on her lips. It's not just me, she said. You've changed too. This estate wouldn't be what it is now without you. He gave a small nod, his gaze distant. Maybe, but it's you who gave it purpose. They sat together in companionable silence, the garden alive with the sounds of children laughing and birds chirping. The monument stood as a quiet testament to the past, a reminder of the love that had endured despite the odds. For Maria, it was more than a tribute. It was a healing. Honoring her mother and father in this way allowed her to let go of the pain and anger she had carried for so long. It gave her a sense of peace, a feeling that their story had finally come full circle. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting golden light over the garden, Maria leaned back on the bench, her heart full. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had found a way to honor while creating something new, something her mother and father would have been proud of. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple as the first stars began to twinkle in the evening sky. The garden glowed softly in the fading light, its vibrant flowers and lush greenery a testament to the new life that had blossomed at the Aldridge estate. Maria sat on the bench beneath the magnolia tree, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the locket around her neck. The unveiling of the memorial had brought a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. For so long, her life had been defined by unanswered questions, hidden truths, and the weight of her mother's sacrifices. Now, standing on the foundation of her parents' love and courage, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before: hope. The next morning, Maria awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The estate, once an imposing and silent monument to privilege, now thrived with activity and connection. Families bustled in the hallways. Children laughed as they played in the gardens, and volunteers worked diligently to prepare meals in the newly restored kitchens. Maria walked through the estate, greeting everyone she passed, her heart swelling with pride. In the dining hall, she found Mr. Aldridge speaking with one of the volunteers about upcoming plans for the estate's new programs. When he saw Maria, he waved her over, his expression warm. We were just discussing the educational initiative, he said. There's interest in using one of the old wings for a community school. Maria's face lit up. That's a wonderful idea, she said. Imagine the possibilities, children from the nearby villages coming here to learn, to dream. It's exactly what this place should be. Mr. Aldridge nodded, his eyes thoughtful. It's amazing to think how far we've come in such a short time. None of this would have happened without you. Maria smiled, though she shook her head modestly. It wasn't just me, she said. This has been a collective effort. From you, the volunteers, and the families who believed in this vision. But most of all, it's been about honoring my mother and Edward. Their love gave me the strength to do this. Mr. Aldridge placed a hand on her shoulder. You've given this estate a purpose beyond anything I could have imagined, he said. And in doing so, you've brought something back to me that I thought I'd lost long ago, a sense of belonging. As the months passed, the estate continued to evolve. The once grand but cold house became a vibrant hub for the community. Rooms that had been closed for decades now housed families who had found safety and stability within the estate's walls. The gardens, once reserved for ornamental flowers, flourished with fruits and vegetables that fed those in need. Workshops and classes were held in the refurbished East Wing, teaching skills like carpentry, sewing, and farming to those looking for a fresh start. Maria thrived in her role as the heart of the estate's transformation. She worked tirelessly, meeting with families, coordinating with volunteers, and ensuring that every corner of the estate reflected its new purpose. Her compassion and determination inspired everyone around her, from the youngest child in the community to Mr. Aldridge himself, who found a renewed sense of purpose in supporting her vision. One evening, as the estate settled into a peaceful quiet, Maria stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens. The lights from the windows cast a warm glow over the landscape, and the sounds of distant laughter and soft music floated through the air. She thought of her mother and Edward, of the love they had shared and the legacy they had left behind. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Mr. Aldridge's voice came from behind her. She turned to see him stepping onto the balcony, his hands tucked into his pockets. Maria smiled. "As ready as I'll ever be," she said. Tomorrow marked the estate's official opening as a community sanctuary, a celebration of everything they had accomplished. Local officials, villagers, and the families who now called the estate home would gather to mark the occasion. For Maria, it was more than a ceremony. It was a new beginning. "I think they'd be proud," Mr. Aldridge said softly, his gaze drifting to the memorial beneath the magnolia tree. Maria nodded, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "They would be, but this is just the start." He smiled at her, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "You've turned this house into something extraordinary, Maria. It's a gift, not just to this community, but to everyone who will walk through its doors in the years to come." Maria looked out at the gardens once more, her heart full. The estate was no longer just a relic of the past. It had become a living, breathing symbol of hope, resilience, and transformation, a place where people could find healing and second chances, just as she had. As the stars filled the night sky, Maria felt the weight of her journey fall away, replaced by a lightness she hadn't known was possible. The future stretched before her, filled with endless possibilities. And for the first time, she felt ready to embrace it. "This is my home now," she said softly, more to herself than to Mr. Aldridge. "And it's exactly where I'm meant to be." The next day, as the sun rose over the Aldridge estate, Maria stood at the gates, welcoming the first guests to the celebration. The air buzzed with excitement, and as she looked around at the smiling faces, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This was the future she had fought for, a future built on love, courage, and the determination to turn pain into something beautiful. And as she stepped forward to address the crowd, she knew that the story of the Aldridge estate was no longer one of loss and secrets. It was a story of hope. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.